Hi, everyone. This is Rafi. I'm here with my friend Tucker. It's been about 2 years, Tucker, I think, since we last did a podcast together. So how have you been?
I've been good for the most part. It's kind of hard to believe it's been that long.
Yeah,
Really hard to believe, actually. It feels like it was just a month or two ago. But the last 2020 was kind of that kind of year. It just like flashed by and knocked everything a kilter, it seems.
yeah, definitely. And I've heard you on a bunch of podcasts, especially during the pandemic. I really like the one you did with Ali Houston.
Yes,
Um,
that was fun.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that was really good, and we learned a lot about the I think it was the sort of natural experiment that happened on the ship, right, with the containment of the small population of people, and we got to see how the virus spread. So maybe
Yeah,
if we just
that's
start
the
by
Paleo
jumping back in the
Canteen.
past.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's the
Paleo
Paleo
Canteen
Canteen
podcast.
podcast, if anybody's looking for that.
hmm So if you bring us back to that moment, because for me it was sort of a crucial moment in the pandemic. What did you learn from that? And I think it'll give us context for what's happening today, and what we're seeing today.
Well, what that showed us is that contrary to what some of the initial models had said, the famous Imperial College model by Neil Ferguson, that in a controlled environment, given that base, so in viral models, when they model spread, they basically lock a bunch of animals into cages next to each other and then see how many of them get the virus, which is basically exactly what happened in this cruise ship. Everybody was locked in their rooms. And then there were stewards, I guess, who would walk back and forth feeding everybody between the rooms. So as a PhD student, you probably think, gee, it sounds like my lab. This is what I do for a living. And what's interesting is only 20% of the people on the ship got the virus. And they were there for rather a while. So it was a pretty good controlled experiment for humans, as good as you're going to get. And some of the models had said it was quote unquote a new novel coronavirus. So they figured, I think Neil Ferguson modeled potential spread at like 97% of the population, which makes it sound very alarming. But when you start looking at only 20%, all of a sudden the potential fatality numbers come down a lot. And also it wasn't nearly as fatal as people were saying. I can't remember what fatality numbers were off the top of my head on that ship, but it was way lower than the 3 to 10% that people were initially forecasting. So we've had a bunch of other studies come out looking at natural immunity to this thing since then. And they're finding natural immunity, pre-existing immunity from the papers I've seen, 30 up to 80%. Well, 80% correlates really well with what happened on that ship, where 80% of the people didn't get it. And what seems to be the case is that there's a lot of cross immunity between both SARS-1, the SARS from, I think it was 2009 when that went around, and from existing coronaviruses, and potentially the existing 4 endemic coronaviruses that have been around for decades, and also potentially from some coronaviruses that had gone around that had never been noticed, right? I mean, it's important to understand the most pre-SARS, the most dangerous coronavirus was one that was discovered in the 1960s. So these have been around for a long time, and it's entirely, and they're not really tracked the way influenza is, right? Every year they look for new strains of influenza. For coronavirus, they don't bother to do that unless something's really dangerous, like SARS, MERS, and now SARS-2. So it's entirely possible that a similar strain of coronavirus that wasn't particularly dangerous, like some of the endemic ones that we're familiar with, had gone around and conferred some kind of immunity against this. And that's why we're seeing higher than initially predicted levels of immunity to this thing.
So how crazy is it
Lost.
that the Ferguson team didn't really model in any prior immunity? I've tried to understand this, and I can't really come up with like with a good reason why you do that. It just doesn't make sense to me. It seems like just the cross immunity that you get amongst existing coronaviruses would be sufficient reason to model that in to some degree. Even if you, I don't know.
Well, I'm going to go full cynic on this one. Ferguson's done this numerous times before with catastrophic predictions. I think he did this for one of the swine flu, I think. Is that H1N1? I can't remember all the
I think so.
numbers for them, but and also for some animal diseases in England that led to a huge cull of some of the agricultural populations of animals, not of people, of course, in England. So he's done this repeatedly before, and it's a fine way to get himself on the front page of lots of newspapers and get his predictions out there. So I can't think of a more charitable explanation for making the same mistake repeatedly. There was a big stink coming out in the spring when some computer science people looked at a revised version of his model. He apparently teamed up with a bunch of professional computer scientists who helped him clean up his model, which gets into a field, guys from Microsoft and I think Google, which gets into my field of expertise. At one point in my career, I had a staff of computer scientists who were programmers reporting to me, working on models that I'd initially developed. And he basically had done rookie mistake 101, which he didn't have any sort of version control, apparently, on his model. So anybody would go in and make changes to the model and it would change the predictions. Now that's typically something, whenever you change a program, you're going to change the output, but typically you do strict version control. In the financial industry, you're required to do version control because you have to be able to go back at any given point in time and say, okay, this model produced this output, we made this change, and now it's producing a different output. You have to be able to explain that. He apparently never did that. He just went through and just kept tweaking the thing. And, when that's your model development process, you literally get to the point where you have no idea what your model's doing. It's out of control, because you keep changing things, the outputs keep changing. And that appears to be what he's continued to do. He just keeps looking at the real world and tweaking the model. And I mean, some of the, I went back and looked at what was happening in Italy right after the Italian lockdowns, because I wanted to understand if these lockdowns were effective. And just looking at the initial data, it was obvious that Ferguson's model was a joke, because his basic assumption, first off, he had two basic assumptions. One, that it was undergoing exponential growth. If I remember correctly, he was, I can't remember exactly, but it was probably between 7 and 15% is the exponential growth he was modeling per day, right? Okay, so looking at Italy, it was obvious that right off the bat, it went up a lot faster than that. It was actually 40% per day, right? So it was just this explosive initial spread of the virus. But it fell steadily, and it fell steadily and consistently regardless of what the interventions were. So go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarify, so as I've come to understand it, it's a curve that's accelerating so fast that actually right from the start, you see it decelerating. So it has this, like, if you look at it, you can actually just about see it, and you can see that it starts so fast that it's also immediately starting to decelerate and sort of peak down. And that's typical
exactly right.
Of many coronaviruses and influenzas, right? They follow this pattern, especially when there's no large amount of prior immunity, and it's new season or it's a new mutation that's more virulent or something like that.
Right, and saying there's no large amount of prior immunity just means that there's a population that's lacking that prior immunity, right?
Yeah,
because
it could be there's just way more old people, for instance, who can lose immunity or something like that.
Exactly. So then, what's the guy's name? Michael is it Michael Schwartz, the Nobel Prize winner, who came out and did a similar analysis to what I had done in Italy. Ivor Cummings has talked about this in some of his podcasts. And he looked at a bunch of different countries beyond Italy and found exactly the same thing, that, you saw this very typical curve of growth and then decline. Something that my simple model also showed, although I didn't, my model showed a faster decline than what happened in practice, but just the simple decay of the exponential, quote unquote, because it was exponential growth is, say, 15% every day, boom, 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 boom. And if you plot that out, it goes straight up at the end, right? On Wall Street, because in Wall Street, we're doing this all the time, right? We're trying to predict growth curves for companies. And there's a saying on Wall Street that no tree grows to heaven, right? There's no such thing as a sustainable exponential growth curve outside of a computer model. It just never happens in reality. So using that as a predictive tool is just, I don't even want to say sophomoric, because it's not fair to sophomores to claim that they would do something like that. Just looking at any data will show you that that never happens. So I don't know. But it was really good for getting him a lot of press and, getting a lot of politicians to pay attention. I guess being Chicken Little works to some extent, at least in his career, it seems to have. So
it's sad, and I think it's one more mistake in the saga of mistakes, such as PCR is another really interesting area where we see a lot of basic mistakes, and it was detailed in a really good article by Michael Yeadon, the ex-Pfizer vice president, where he was explaining a lot of the changes that took place in the UK, where instead of funding the NHS and their trained staff and giving them, more staff and more means to do their work properly, they just put all that money into new infrastructure, which then had to be manned by other people who were less competent and less well-trained and less well-oiled, and had terrible protocols and had people with no experience for handling highly, infectious, whatever grade lab that is, to handle those sort of materials. And you look at these, mistakes in the logistics, and then the mistakes in the designing of the PCR test based on some, misaligned primers and some sequence data rather than a fully live cultured virus, which you could properly sequence. And, having to take things on faith from China, for God's sake, and all of these mistakes, from science to the politicians to the logistics and just to how it's implemented. I mean, it's a lot. I have to be honest. And when
not
you're
only,
in the
not only that, I mean, PCR tests, as one doctor from the Skeptical Science site, David Gorski, pointed out, PCR tests have been around for a while, and they have some flaws, which are well known, and but it's a useful tool, right? It will tell you if somebody has or had a viral infection, right?
It's amazing.
It's pretty good at that. The problem is it can tell you that, you may have had one quite a while ago, but it says nothing about what we want to know, which is, are you infectious, right? And when you start going up into the high cycles of, multiplying the DNA fragment that you've got, you're looking at, if you're using it as a test for, is a person infectious, which is how we're using it, it gets up to the point where it has a 97% false positive rate, which is why a court in Portugal said that it's not a valid test to use in determining if somebody should be quarantined, right? Because 97% false positive, that's ridiculous. At lower cycle levels, it's much more effective in telling whether somebody actually has the virus and is infectious, but that's not how it's used anywhere that I'm aware of. And there have been a couple of papers that have come out that have, by recognized experts, who tried to correlate PCR cycle values to actually incubating vaccine or virus from people and seeing if they were infectious. And I think it's around between 30 and 35 cycles where it just becomes a useless test to determine infectivity. But,
Yeah, that's right.
you know, and then there's the fact that the authorities as of 2019 wouldn't allow just a PCR test to define a case. You had to have some clinical findings that a person, like symptoms that a
Yeah.
person was actually had the disease. And it's just, you just keep looking at all these things that changed when this came on the scene. And strangely enough, every single one of them was to promote fear and panic about this virus. And none of them seem to be on saying, okay, let's come up with a reasonable estimation of risk. I mean, we knew early on that this was virus, from what happened in Italy that mostly affected old people, right? I mean,
Yeah, and actually it's biological age that's even more predictive than chronological age, which is really interesting when you
right.
understand how susceptible people with metabolic syndrome or heart disease are to this particular strain of coronavirus. I think that's pretty telling.
Although all across the age spectrum, if you have diabetes, for instance, you're more susceptible to this, which, we can get into as far as my favorite topic, linoleic acid, and how this virus spreads and how your body reacts to it, and why it might make sense that people who have diabetes and obesity would be more susceptible to serious outcomes from this virus than others.
They have more Tinder, right? Is that the underlying idea?
Well,
they have more Tinder.
Not more Tinder. Let's say you've got a fire and you've got two options to put out the fire. One is water and the other is gasoline. Which one are you going to use, right? Well, if you're on a lousy industrial diet, effectively your body's full of a lot of gasoline, and that's what your body's going to start using to put out the fire. And it does all the damage, again, back to the published research. This isn't me speculating here. I did a long blog post about omega-6 fats and SARS and ARDS, walking through the established mechanisms, which mystifyingly to me, I've not seen anybody else, any professional scientist, come out and walk through all these established mechanisms. I've seen papers making similar claims to what I've made, but not walking through all the mechanisms. I've heard people talk about a lipid storm of polyunsaturated fats, but they never seem to walk right through to what your white blood cells do with those polyunsaturated fats and how that brings around some of the more severe symptoms of an ARDS, of a case of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. SARS is, what does SARS stand for again? Good heavens, it's been too long. Severe acute respiratory syndrome. Right. So SARS kills you by bringing on ARDS, and polyunsaturated omega-6 fats also induce ARDS. So if you combine those two, you seem to get a much worse outcome theoretically than if you don't. At least the data that we have in humans shows that if you have more polyunsaturated N6 fats in your body, you're way more susceptible to ARDS. And it's starting to look like that may be the mechanism behind why those same people are more susceptible to ARDS. And that also seems to be what's causing our epidemics of diabetes and obesity and heart disease, in my opinion.
Okay.
So we've got like 12 hours of material we could go.
yeah, precisely that. I'm not sure where to go next, but I'll try to link it with what we were talking about with respect to the scientific mistakes, because there's so much energy put into the question of lockdowns or no locking down, masks or no masks. Okay, we finally got a little bit of mainstream attention for vitamin D, which is a good thing, I guess, although they're still not understanding that if you're inside all the time, locked down, you're not going to get any vitamin D and all the other benefits from being outside. But, what about talking about what you could do for your health prevention? Without offering miracles, a lot of the basic metabolic care that you can afford yourself, I think, is going to make a big difference in COVID. And speaking completely anecdotally, in my family, so I got it 2 weeks ago. My girlfriend got it about 2 months ago. My mom got it 2 weeks ago, as did my dad, my brother, and my sister-in-law. We're all fine. My
That's
dad is
great to hear. That
73.
was my
Yeah.
next question.
Yeah,
Glad to hear
we're all
that.
fine. We're all fine, honestly. It was like a bad flu. Sorry if that hurts people's ears or hearts, but it's true. That's how we experienced it. But there is a person in my family, the husband of my cousin, died from it, and he was a 65-year-old man with very serious heart issues, pre-existing heart
Right.
condition.
Right.
And
And
sadly,
which,
yeah.
again, I mean, I don't like people thinking, I don't like the way people say, because you're accurately trying to understand the risks of this, that you're denying it.
Mhm.
That's incredibly unscientific.
Yeah.
I mean, I come from a background in risk management, and you can't accurately and effectively react to something until you understand what sort of threat it
Hmm.
uh, represents. So this is not, this it's more dangerous than the flus that we're used to in the last 50 years. There's no question about that. And certainly for some populations, it's quite a lot dangerous than the flus that we've been used to for the last 50 years. So it's, you
Hmm.
know, it, I hate to say it, but it's nothing to sneeze at, but it's also
Hmm.
not justified to react the way that we have reacted to this.
We've made it way worse. I mean, so much worse. And you're right. It's the stratification of risk. I think people fail, like they have to visualize it as if it was a tree, it'd be like this very thin tree trunk of very tiny risk. And then at the top, when you get really old, it'd explode outwards. And that's where you'd
Right,
have most of the deaths, right? If you imagine it like a tree. And
right.
you can really start to appreciate the need to have a targeted approach at a population level for a certain population. It tells you also, it's going to give you a hint about how you should maybe distribute the vaccine, and how you should run clinical trials and look at specific populations and not try to have a bigger market for your vaccine by looking at, quote, everyone, but not having enough power to detect changes in the population you're most interested in, which is the older population. So there are a lot of things we can, do better once we understand that age and risk stratification that you're talking about. And yeah, I wish it weren't turned into a question of denial or total blind acceptance. And we could actually talk about the nuances in there. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I've got a little chart here that I can actually,
mhm,
that I put together. If you want to enable screen sharing, we can,
let's see.
that shows exactly what you were just talking about.
So you want to share your screen, Tucker?
Yeah. So this is a little together a while ago. It's based off a study that I find that showed COVID mortality by diabetes status and age in the UK.
Hmm.
Everybody always asks over here, what is other diabetes? DM is diabetes mellitus. So we have type 1 diabetes in orange, type 2 in gray, and then other diabetes in yellow. Everybody always asks what the yellow is, and I don't know, but that's what the study had. Apparently, sometimes it's just marked as diabetes and not specified whether it's type 2 or type 1. And then, so that's the axis going away from the viewer. The axis going to the left of the viewer is by age, right? And then the back corner at 100% is regular year mortality. This is, I just used 2018. All-cause mortality relative risk by age, right? So all years is 100%. And if you look at the relative risk of people who are over 80 years old, that's a huge explosion in risk, exactly what you were
Yeah.
just describing, right?
Yeah.
But then if you look at the columns going forward, the columns ahead, the other colored columns, you'll see similar, 0 to 39 degree risk. If you're type 1 diabetes, you have a 0 relative risk of dying of COVID. But it goes up pretty steadily with age, and it's much higher if you're over 80 than if you have no diabetes. So there's a definite stratification that could easily have been done based on pretty quickly available data that they've just decided to ignore, and it's inexplicable because they're doing, I think in England 700,000 people have been put into poverty by the lockdown measures. In the United States it's 8 million people. It's incalculable the harm that this has done to people.
6.7 million kids will go hungry this year. 6.7 million extra kids will go hungry this year because of it. And I think close to 500,000 kids will miss their tuberculosis vaccination. So for all this talk about the importance of vaccines, we're going to mess their chances up when tuberculosis is a fantastic vaccine. The number needed to treat is extremely low compared to what seems to be the case for this mRNA vaccine. And I think people don't take that into account when doing a cost-benefit analysis, that they're putting at risk these programs that are doing excellent work. And we're going to fuck it up to push through a vaccine that could be a success story in terms of scientific advancement, but it's definitely a failure in terms of open and honest communication and sharing of data and setting up the trials to really target the most vulnerable populations and selecting the endpoints that are really most meaningful, like hospital admissions rather than some random PCR test and one or more positive symptoms. There's a lot of
just basic risk management. It's just been a bad exercise in basic risk management. I mean,
at so many levels.
Yeah. Over here in the United States, some idiot professor has come out and said that, a proper risk management approach would be, as that chart just showed, older people are at most risk from this, so they should be first in line for vaccinations. And this guy came out and said, oh no, we should do it by race because and he basically acknowledged that this would be, cause excess, quote unquote, excess death, that wonderful term. He was perfectly willing to have old people of the wrong race die so that he could, feel better about himself by treating younger people who are at far less risk. It's just insanity. I mean, when you're doing risk management, you want to address the people who are most at risk. That should be obvious. It's without question older people. I mean, the numbers, I think, the numbers they're just overwhelming. Even in Italy initially, it was like 98% of the people who died were in their 70s and 80s with multiple comorbidities. And if you were outside of that stratification, you had minute risk. So it just doesn't make any sense. But it's been an interesting year. Definitely not good for faith in medicine or medical science. That's for sure.
Oh, that's for sure. I've actually learned quite a bit in terms of different different assumptions going to different models. I think that was very informative for me. A lot of what you talked about relative to how you basically the faith you put in these never-ending exponential curves and all that ensues from that, and the asymptomatic spread. I learned a lot in terms of distinguishing the difference between pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic spread, and we do seem to have pre-symptomatic spread, but not really asymptomatic spread, or not to any significant degree.
Well, I don't know. I still don't know about that because, we have papers going back to the 60s talking about how coronavirus spreads through populations. And there has to be some kind of asymptomatic spread. I mean, there are papers looking at influenza and coronavirus propagation over the summer months when typically population penetration goes way down. And they're still not clear what exactly happens. But yes, it definitely seems to be much less of a concern than was initially thought. It's probably enough to keep a virus alive in a population, but you need a bunch of other factors to come in to get the sort of spread that we see every year with our seasonal influenza. So
do you think you can spread COVID and never ever develop any symptoms?
I don't see why not. I mean, every other virus that we're aware of spreads that way, right? I mean, some people may get a sniffle, and yes, that's a symptom, but that's not, like what you were describing, where it's a bad flu. And I just don't think they're doing the sort of longitudinal tracking that would enable them to categorically say no. I think it's kind of a moot point at the end of the day, but it definitely speaks. The interesting part is, if it's far lower than what we'd initially thought, it tells us that these high cycle PCR tests are a lot less useful than we had thought. Because if you're positive at 40 or 45 cycles, you're probably not a danger to anybody if you're not positive at 30 cycles. So that would cut the case numbers. Another funny little, call it a mistake or an oversight that they've made, is they don't report the number of cycles at which you come positive,
Right.
which would be a fine way to assess the risk of somebody who's PCR positive, right? If you're PCR positive at 45, you're probably not a risk to anybody, and you shouldn't be considered a case. That's for darn sure. Right?
Yeah.
Another definition that changed was cases. Cases used to mean under medical care of some sort. Now it means anybody who's positive on a PCR test. Never used that definition before this year. So anyway.
Yeah, that's pretty egregious too.
Yeah, but
very
good for
but
scaring the
what's
daylights
been
out of
worse
people.
is the herd immunity definition that's been mangled and completely replaced on the WHO's website.
Yes, I
couldn't believe that. That was crazy. Now it only applies to the herd immunity through vaccination. I mean,
well, again, another change they made that promotes panic. It's odd, I mean, one of the things that I did in my professional career was detecting financial fraud. And it's a basic principle that if you see a bunch of changes to a set of numbers, the changes should be, if they're genuine changes, like adjustments in an accounting context, they should be pretty random, right? If they all go one way, then that's an indication of some kind of fraud, right? And it's just really troublesome that all of these changes we've seen over the last year all go in the direction of promoting further panic about this particular virus consistently. I can't think of a single one that's gone in the other direction.
So help me understand, how can you be a doctor, and especially a doctor in, say, a low carb community that's used to government fuck ups with regards to health policies and how badly we can get it wrong, How do you then not see it happen here? Help me understand that.
That's a great example, because a lot of these guys last year were talking about relative risk versus absolute risk, and how relative risk was used to scare people in scientific and medical studies all the time, because they say, oh, this drug is going to lower your relative risk of this disease by 20%, but your absolute risk of this disease is minute. So that change is meaningful. Now, all of a sudden, they seem to have totally forgotten about that. And all they're willing to talk about is your relative risk. Oh, if you get coronavirus, your relative risk goes up a lot. Yeah, but your absolute risk is still pretty darn low. I mean, what is it? 99.97 people, 99.97% of people who get this thing survive. That's a microscopic risk. And yes, it's a much higher relative risk than influenza, but it's still a minute risk, and certainly not worth destroying world economies over, in my humble opinion. Only history will tell how correct that one was. But, we didn't do this for polio or measles or we tried it a little bit with the first, not the first, but the 1918 Spanish, quote unquote, Spanish flu. And it didn't work then. I mean, the military is now rediscovering what they'd already published after 1918, which is none of these measures work. We just need to suck it up and deal with this thing, right? So why was that valid knowledge for the previous 101 years until 1919, and then all of a sudden it went out the window. What kind of, evidence? But I like to say the first casualty of this pandemic was evidence-based medicine.
Yeah.
Everything that we learned went right out the window at the beginning of 2020.
Yeah, that's insane. When I saw that WHO website side by side, the change using Web Archive, and it's just one thing after another. And I'm just more worried about this becoming cyclical in terms of health scares, where there's really a curtailing of general. I mean, look, in France, we're told that we can't have more than 6 people in our home at New Year's. And now from 2nd of January onwards, our curfew is at 6 p.m. And you need a notice to tell people you're working if you leave your house after 6 p.m. or you're going to the pharmacy, or I don't know what you're
or
doing.
The bathroom. It's like being in
This
elementary
is
school.
This is insane. And like, you order food from Uber Eats and they tell you, remember to wash your hands. Like, who the fuck do you think I am? Like, you're not my mom. Like, leave me alone.
Right.
Stop
Do they really
pestering
say
me
that?
with your, yeah, I swear to God, it's everywhere. It's in your phone. It's your neighbors who are telling you about your mask. It's everyone's a damn, like, I don't know. Everyone has has taken on this role of like health Nazi.
Of your mother, health Nazi, yes.
Health Nazi of your mother. And no one can tell you why they believe what they believe. And if you ask them, it's an offense.
Well, if you ask them questions,
Yeah.
you're a denialist.
You're just,
it's like
yeah.
the flat earthers have taken over the world. It's just nuts. But I don't know, the political motivations behind this are probably a whole nother topic, and I'm not going to go into that because
me neither. It's a rabbit hole. And
yeah,
at least for me, it's productive in the sense that I actually have to understand a lot of new things in order to get a sense of what's going on with the pandemic. But it always brings me back to the basics of diet and lifestyle and that sort of stuff. So I guess we could transition into that, because I read a really interesting paper with regards to our favorite hated fatty acid, linoleic acid, and how obesogenic and inflammatory it can be, and that sort of stuff. And there's a nice paper looking at humans and mice and the effect of the gut microbiota on maybe mitigating some of those effects. And it's anyone's guess what that could mean for us in our lifetimes. But I don't know. Did you, so you didn't get a chance to read it, but you got to see what it was about?
Well, as we discussed before, I went skiing this morning.
Yeah. So yeah.
And Gabor flagged this on Twitter just as I was heading out the door, and I was like, "This is not important."
You're right.
Compared to getting my run in. So I skimmed it a little bit. I mean, look, I've got a post that I've got to wrap up on this exact topic, looking at what the literature says about what causes obesity in humans and in rodents. And it revolves around, so now basically what this paper is doing is looking at a strain of bacteria that converts linoleic acid into some chemical whose acronym is HYA, and apparently this is protective against obesity. Okay, that's, I'll take that at face value. But whenever you see a study like this, you have to look at it in the context of the existing literature, right? In 2006 in the EU, there was approved a drug called rimonabant. Rimonabant was basically a miracle drug. It reduced obesity and all the associated symptoms. It reduced HbA1c, it reduced high blood pressure. It's literally a miracle drug. Never got approved in the United States, and it turned out that one of the ways in which lab rats are a bad model for human drugs is that they aren't able to commit suicide. So in humans, rimonabant made people want to kill themselves. So it was yanked from the market. So, okay, but it was effective as far as it went, other than the suicide thing. in animal models and in human models. Okay, great. So we have a mechanism here that's been explored subsequently in detail in a raft of animal models, which is how you do mechanistic studies trying to figure out what a drug actually does. You can't do this stuff in humans. So what is it? What have they found out? Well, they found out that there's a pathway where you eat linoleic acid and it converts into arachidonic acid in your body. And that gets converted into 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG, which is an endocannabinoid. Also another endocannabinoid called, the acronym is AEA, but it has a much better name. Anyway, that'll come back to me, but it's known as the joy hormone, or the joy.
Oh, anandamide.
Anandamide, yes, thank you.
Right.
Anandamide, it's the joy chemical, right? Or molecule or
Or
whatever.
bliss or something like that in Sanskrit.
Yeah, that's right. So anand means bliss in Hindi, apparently. Now, these two chemicals are really interesting because they induce obesity, right? So if you take a rat and you let it feed until it's not full anymore and it stops eating, and you inject 2-AG into its brain, it will start eating again. And they've done this in parallel with another chemical we're all familiar with, THC. THC is the active ingredient in marijuana that produces the effect that everybody wants from marijuana, but also apparently produces the munchies, right? So rimonabant blocks THCs causing the munchies, and it also blocks the effect of linoleic acid in causing an increased level of 2-AG, which induces overeating in animals, and we presume, since the drug also works in humans, right? And of course, we all know that people get the munchies because we've got millions and millions of people who've confessed to that particular problem. One of the funniest jokes I ever heard was talking about some snowboarder who had his medal taken away at the Olympics because they found that he had been smoking pot. And the joke was, how can pot be considered a performance enhancing drug unless they put a candy bar at the end of the run? He got his medal back, by the way, because they couldn't argue for how it was a performance enhancing drug. But at any rate, so we know this is a mechanism that exists both in humans and animals. Well enough so that we've got drugs and a bunch of further drugs. Now, the problem with rimonabant was that it worked in the brain and the entire body, which is why it caused you to want to commit suicide. So what they're working on now, it turns out 2-AG is produced in your gut when you eat linoleic acid, but not by any other fats. They've done this study on a fat by fat basis. Since stearic acid is been a popular topic lately, stearic acid is less palatable than mineral oil, which they used as the neutral control in this study. Rats would rather eat mineral oil than stearic acid. So if you're wondering why stearic acid may seem to have some sort of anti-obesity effect, that could be part of it.
You know what's interesting about that? I'm just thinking of, have you ever had kidney fat? Right, just sliced.
Lard? Yes.
Yeah, like just the raw natural kidney fat. Yeah, so it's interesting because
suet if it's comes from a cow.
Exactly. Because it's interesting, depending, if I have it just lightly pan fried, it's very palatable. If I have, let's say if I just heat it up in a pan and I let it, accumulate, I'm going to fry a T-bone in it or something. And I collect that, that fat, that rendered fat, basically. It's not that it's unpalatable. It's just too rich. It's not, it would fill me up way too fast, like way more than cream, for instance, which has this different kind of texture. So I'm wondering if it has something to do with that, because the form in which I consume it really does affect how much of it I can eat.
Well, so the two, I don't know about, I can't remember lard, but I know in tallow, the two main fats in tallow are stearic acid and oleic acid. and it's got only trace amounts of linoleic acid.
Mm-hmm.
So the other interesting thing that these papers have shown is that the only other fat that stimulates eating, like linoleic acid does, is oleic acid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the fat that's like 46% of tallow, I think. But oleic acid, so linoleic acid produces AEA and 2-AG, which make you eat, right? Oleic acid produces OEA. OEA stops you from eating. It's a satiety signal. Now, this would make perfect sense. If you're eating natural fats, which are rich in oleic acid, initially you want to eat it, and then after a while you've had enough and you want to stop, right? That's fine. So what else happens in these animal models when they feed them, an industrial diet with a lot of linoleic acid in it? It also stops the production of OEA in response to oleic acid consumption. So it not only produces a signal that makes you want to eat more, it breaks the signal that tells you you're full, stop eating.
Right.
So the paper today is interesting. I'll take a look at it again, but you got to take it in the context that there's, this is one of the most open and closed cases in nutritional literature that I've come across, where we have a specific mechanism that's been tested repeatedly and a human approved drug that has the desired effect on the mechanism.
Yeah, it's to me it was more so interesting. Not that it was going to change any of the practical advice I think we would give on the matter of seed oil consumption. More so that maybe it could tell us about how we respond to seed oil consumption, depending maybe on our pre-existing gut flora, or how we're likely to then change our gut flora in function of the seed oils that we consume or not consume.
I mean, it could explain, there's a bunch of papers looking at full fat dairy consumption and obesity, showing that increased full fat dairy consumption is inversely related to obesity, and skim milk especially is very highly promotes obesity. Now, skim milk is a highly processed food, right? A food like yogurt, which is a less, yogurt today is produced industrially, but it was a pre-industrial processed food, contains a lot of lactobacillus. So maybe part of the reason that you see this anti-obesity effect from full fat dairy is from yogurt consumption altering the gut microbiome and increasing the population of lactobacillus, which is converting linoleic acid into this anti-obesogenic metabolite. Yeah, that sounds plausible. Sounds like your next PhD project there.
Yeah, exactly. It's basically just detoxifying it in a sense. I mean, if that's what it's doing for us, it would be pretty amazing. I think it's kind of having like a second liver, but it's just your gut microbes helping you out. That's pretty cool.
There are lots of examples of gut microbes having beneficial effects. Some of them can digest gluten, which may be part of the reason why some people do better with gluten than other people do. There was a famous study that came out of Japan a few years ago that showed that people's gut microbes had taken up some DNA from, I think, some seaweed that they ate, which allowed them to digest something or another, in a way that other people were. So that's totally plausible. The only thing I don't like about the whole gut microbiome discussion is that it's like the worst black box out there.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's fascinating and terrible at the same time.
That's exactly. It's fascinating and it's super plausible. And, but I've never seen any other than C. diff using fecal transplants to treat C. difficile. I've never seen any effective mechanism demonstrated that way. They did also manage to transplant obesity along with the fecal transplant, but they've not been able to transplant resistance to obesity in humans. Or I believe the mouse study that showed that was retracted.
Mm.
So that would be cool if it worked, or
Yeah.
if you could figure out how to do it effectively. But yeah, at this point, I pay, I pay very little attention to that. That said, I had a friend who wasn't able to digest cheese for his whole life.
Hmm.
And a bunch of us decided to try this supplement of these soil bacteria that I can't remember what it's called now, but it was on
Is
Chris
it
Kresser's.
VSL3?
I can't remember. This was a number of
Mm.
years ago. It was on Chris Kresser's website. I think he still sells it, but
It's probably that then, I think. Could
it
be.
could be. But anyway, the idea was
Yeah.
that it was soil bacteria, and because we're too clean now, we don't get a lot of it. Well, I didn't notice anything, but my friend suddenly found that he no longer had a problem digesting cheese after he took
Oh,
this.
wow.
So I'm open to the idea. It's just,
Yeah.
on the other
It might
hand,
as
maybe
well
I
be
didn't see
magic.
enough.
Yeah.
Huh?
It might as well be magic. We don't understand it.
Yeah, basically. Well, but I mean, it's obviously more plausible than magic because we have
Slightly.
examples where it's effective. But,
Yeah.
I've kind of given up on that whole avenue of
Mhm.
personal experimentation just because I never saw any effects from it.
Right. Yeah.
So
Well, so you mentioned that we should probably talk about heart disease if we can take a U-turn and go to a last subject, because it's one of my favorite topics, as you probably know. I'm a big fan of Subbotin's, I would say, addition to the theory of heart disease, the alternative theory of heart disease, one might call it. So I don't know if you had any new insights you wanted to share about the pathogenesis and how we may be able to better understand it than simply this BB gun model of invasion from the lumen, and the more particles the worst, and that's it basically. So
yeah,
care to enlighten us.
I was talking to some doctor. I think he was up at Cornell in a PhD. He was like a doctor, and he was doing experiments. And he called my. We were having a conversation about this, and I can't remember the guy's name right now. Something Wang, and he called my attention to this paper that he had produced, and he claimed that it showed that normal LDL was sufficient to cause atherosclerosis. And I read the paper, and it was really interesting. It taught me something I didn't know, which is that most of the cells that become foam cells aren't either the smooth muscles. No, I think anyway, it was a different type of muscle cell than
Mhm.
is usually understood to be involved in the process. And he showed that this was predominant in his in vitro model. But the problem was he had to have the LDL sitting around for 2 weeks before it would start to induce atherogenesis. And I said, well, one of the things that causes LDL to oxidize is time. So the fact that you had to have it sit there for 2 weeks tells me that LDL doesn't induce atherosclerosis, that it's got to oxidize, which is what happens with time, and then it induces atherosclerosis. And so then I asked the question on Twitter. I was like, there are all these people who are skeptical of what's known as the oxidative stress model of atherosclerosis and hence cardiovascular disease. Is there any other model? Right?
Mhm.
I mean, if you're saying a hypothesis isn't true, you have to have an alternative explanation, or at least some evidence that, sinks the thing. Crickets. So
Yeah.
my understanding is that there is no other explanation for what causes heart disease other than the oxidative stress model. So let's really quickly discuss what the oxidative stress model. Oxidative stress, there are a bunch of keywords that you come across in the literature, and you really need to get down in the weeds to understand what these words mean, right? So oxidative stress is typically described as being reactive oxygen species generation in the mitochondria, right? Which is potentially part of the process. But that's perfectly normal. So the question is, what happens to cause that to become pathological? Well, we have a bunch of markers that they use in the scientific literature to measure this process. They're all linoleic acid metabolites like HNE, MDA, OXLDL, the two markers that we use to measure the oxidation of LDL are HNE and MDA. There are some others that are metabolites of arachidonic acid. Can't remember those right off the top of my head, but they're not great markers, so people really don't use them. So effectively, oxidative stress is as used in the literature, is the process of omega-6 fatty acids oxidizing and becoming toxic. That's what it means, right? So the cardiovascular disease models all are looking at various aspects of this process. And the only thing I've ever seen that really pushes it along, and we can talk a little bit about glycation and glucose, is oxidized N6 fats. There is no other explanation that I've ever seen other than glucose. So, the original papers done on trying, and there are papers that show that normal LDL has no effect, like this poor Dr. Wang's paper, that LDL has to sit and age for 2 weeks before it miraculously suddenly becomes atherogenic, that show that normal LDL is harmless, which is what you would expect, right?
From its chemistry, right?
Well, not just from its chemistry, but it was demonstrated conclusively back in the 1960s that we don't care particularly about atherosclerosis. We care about heart attacks, myocardial infarction, right? We care about atherosclerosis to the extent that it leads to a heart attack, right? The Maasai apparently have massive atherosclerosis and no myocardial infarction. So we don't care about atherosclerosis per se. So back in the 1960s, they did this comprehensive study looking at the possible genetic role played in cardiovascular disease via autopsy, where you can tell if a person had ever had a myocardial infarction. And what they discovered is that there are large populations of genetically similar people who don't get cardiovascular disease, 0 rates. Yet miraculously, those people come to the United States for one reason or another, and all of a sudden they all become subject to cardiovascular disease within a generation or two. So I guess their genes change when they get here. So if you're saying LDL causes heart disease, you are saying that heart disease is a genetic disease because all of us have a gene to produce LDL.
Right.
And yet that was debunked in the 1960s. So,
yeah,
and this isn't me, this is the medical literature that all of these guys are supposed to be learning when they go through medical school. I got into an argument, and I'll explain to you why they don't learn that. I got into an argument on Twitter with a professor of medicine at Harvard who wasn't aware of this study from the 1960s. And she went through all these criticisms of this paper. And the entire thread was her coming up with some reason why the paper was wrong and me explaining to her that they had accounted for that in the paper. She obviously never bothered to read the paper. When she finally looked at the paper, she said, "But it's only been cited 27 times." And I said, yes, that's a problem with you people and with medicine.
right.
That the paper that shows that it's not a genetic disease has been comprehensively ignored.
Right.
So anyway, so that's the end. So yeah, for LDL to cause atherosclerosis, it has to contain oxidized omega-6 fats. And the amount of oxidized omega-6 fats in your LDL is controlled by your dietary intake. And there are multiple papers showing that. So, progression, Subbotin's argument is that the disease process starts in the microvasculature, which is, so in people, you see atherosclerotic lesions, mainly in areas of the arteries that contain what's known as the vasa vasorum, which is basically a network of capillaries behind that come in from the back of the artery to give it nutrients, right? I guess the rest of them just get it from the blood that's flowing through. So his argument, which I think is right, is that that's where it starts, but he doesn't give a mechanism as to why it starts there or what's driving it. So sildenafil is a lot of guys' favorite drugs, the little purple miracle drug known as Viagra. Sildenafil has been shown in papers to protect against oxidized linoleic acid metabolites, like my favorite HNE, and they think that that's the mechanism of action, that it reduces oxidative stress, because not only does it help protect the microvasculature in your penis so that you can have an erection, it's also one of the most effective heart disease prevention drugs out there.
Yeah. By mistake.
By mistake, yeah, but hey, serendipity is wonderful. I'll take serendipity any day of the week. So yeah, I think that largely, and it also, if I remember, I think it's also protective against cancer and a whole other, a few other conditions that are thought to be driven by oxidative stress. So yeah, I mean, Subbotin's model certainly explains why these atherosclerotic lesions start where they do rather than anywhere else, better than any other explanation. But the mechanism, the mechanism's a common mechanism. It's happening all through your body, right? It's happens in your retina. That's what causes age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of blindness. That's one of the few areas of medicine where they're pretty explicit now. They figured out that, if you have a lower level of omega-6 fats in your diet, you're at much less risk for this. And they've gone through mechanistically and started tracking down what exactly is happening. It hasn't yet made it to the dietary guidelines and probably won't in any of our lives. So I certainly wouldn't wait for those to change. But, you start seeing in age-related macular degeneration, which they call Alzheimer's of the eye, interestingly, you see omega-6 fats breaking down into these toxins like HNE, which cause a autoimmune response, right? So the neutrophils and the other white blood cells react to this as they would to a bacterial infection and attack these cells that, as far as they're concerned, have now become infected. They now have all the symptoms of a bacterial infection, so they get attacked. That's not good. I mean, we've all had poison ivy, right? Poison ivy is the exact same thing. The urushiol, the oil in the poison ivy and related plants, like the plant that's used to make lacquer in Japan, is toxic directly related to how much polyunsaturated N6 fats it contains. It's the same mechanism. It's literally, I mean, I think the simplest way to understand atherosclerosis is it's like having a poison ivy rash inside your blood vessels. That would be negative, right? And this is so clearly demonstrated in the literature that one of the leading tests for oxidized LDL and used in various different models of oxidative stress is an antibody called EO6, developed by the doctor who initially showed that dietary linoleic acid controls the oxidizability of LDL. When he came up with this antibody, he discovered that it was a genetic mimic to an innate antibody that we have programmed into our genomes against I think it's either staph or strep. I can never remember which. But so basically, your body can't tell oxidized linoleic acid from a staph infection. And, okay, let's get back to risk control, right? That staph is one of the worst infections. I don't know what mortality is every year from that, but that's a pretty serious infection if you get it. So
Yeah. See, this is sort of the problem with this theory that can explain so many different phenomena, is that it's
yes,
hard to believe, and it's hard to, it's not that it's hard to falsify, but it's just hard
well,
to design. There's a lot of tests you have to
I
do.
let me say it for you.
Yeah.
One of the hallmarks of a quack theory is that it explains everything, and I'm very
Yeah.
aware of that.
It,
But
it,
this is not my theory. I'm just repeating what's in the
yeah.
literature in thousands of papers,
Yeah,
hundreds
but
of
it's what
thousands of papers.
it's sort of like the protons thread that Peter has, where it's sort of these basement mechanisms, like the
Right.
composition of your cells. It doesn't get more fundamental than that. How you generate, a proton gradient in your cells to power yourself, it doesn't get any more basic than that. So when you're explaining things on that level, it's sort of inherent to what you're
Right.
doing, that you're going to be able to explain a lot, because all of these things rest upon these basic mechanisms. So I think people should keep that in mind when why we're confidently speaking about so many different areas of health affected by the degree of saturation of a particular fat. It actually really, really matters to to how we treat COVID, to how we see heart disease, to how poison ivy can irritate our skin.
Yes.
It's kind of amazing in that sense, but it is truly important.
But also in terms of hypotheses, what I like to point out is that people say this is too simple, right? But we have a range of diseases, what we call the chronic or Western diseases, or diseases of affluence, that all appeared in the last 150 years, that appear all around the world whenever what I'll call an American diet gets introduced, which might be unfair to the Germans because they had the same problem around about the same time, and affects multiple species. It's not just humans, right? It's humans, and all of the animals who eat our food have this range of problems. You can't have that wide an effect without it being simple, right? I mean, I've heard people say, scientists have said to me, well, but what about pollution? Okay, well, the fattest population on Earth lives on an island in the South Pacific. What's their problem with pollution?
Right.
And how is that in common with, say, fat pigeons in New York City? What's the common denominator between those two situations, right? Why? There's an argument that it's adenoviruses or bacteria, but we know that viruses don't jump species all that well. So, and also ignoring the fact that we don't have any evidence for this virus, right? What is this virus that manages to infect all these different species who coincidentally only happen to get these diseases when they eat an American diet, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's got to be a fairly simple and fairly generic mechanism for it to have explanatory power of the evidence. That's what you're looking for in a scientific hypothesis. Does it describe the evidence that you have in front of it? And that's not, it's not to say that it's going to be falsified. And I mean, for years, I used to live, for a long time, I had trouble I had this theory based on what happened to myself, and I couldn't find the evidence for it because I didn't know the terms to look for. And, at this point, there's so much evidence for it. I find it hard to believe that it could be falsified. It's not impossible,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Well, we'll see how much it can lead in terms of what it can lead to in terms of treatment. I'll be curious to see if one day it gets accepted by the mainstream. Of course, they're going to want to make it druggable, but let's see if they can do anything interesting with that, because it's not going to be easy when removal seems the first and maybe not the only step, but definitely the first one: removal of the offending factor.
Well, we're gonna have to see a revolution in medicine for that to happen, unfortunately, because just as you pointed out for nobody's promoting changes in lifestyle to treat COVID, which is probably wise because the changes in lifestyle that the medical profession advocates for people would make
Right.
COVID
Would make things
worse.
worse. Yeah.
I mean, you need to understand type 2 diabetes is effectively an iatrogenic disease. It's a disease that's caused by doctors and bad dietary advice. So they're going to have to ditch that and come up with an effective treatment and realize that it's better for their patients and that they actually care enough about their patients to recommend this more effective yet unprofitable treatment to people. I mean, we have at this point, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is 30, it's the leading cause of liver failure in the world. 30 to 40% of Americans, I think, have NAFLD. And we have 3 papers in humans showing that it can be cured with a low omega-6 diet.
Yeah.
In humans.
No biggie, guys.
one of which had 100% efficacy rate. Please show me a drug study that's 100% effective.
Yeah.
And, crickets, they don't care. It's a shame. They just don't seem to care.
Yeah, it's gonna take a lot more fighting, but it's worth it. It's there's a lot to be leveraged there. So I'll keep banging that drum. I'll keep pushing the low carb drum and the low linoleic acid drum. I'll do that confidently, and I'll happily be called a quack for doing so.
You will be an excellent company, me included at the front of the line.
Yeah, that'll keep us plenty busy, and with plenty enough controversy to not get bored, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And
there's enough people. I mean, I really do think the way this is going to spread is, as much as the medical profession likes to go on about studies and RCTs, even they don't find them compelling, right? What compels people is anecdotes from people you trust, right? Even doctors, most of the medical information they get are from anecdotes. Oh, I tried this and it worked really well on my patient. And as more and more doctors do it themselves, and more doctors start seeing patients where everything gets better all at once, as I've seen myself and people I've given as little as a sentence of advice, gee, miraculously, I lose all my weight, I feel great, my autoimmune disease goes away, and what the heck is going on here? That's how it's going to spread. It's going to spread by anecdote. It's going to be bottom up. It's not going to come through the scientific or the medical establishments. That's an edifice that's designed to make profits, not to make people healthy, unfortunately.
Yep, I think that's true. But hopefully one of the social media platforms will stay sufficiently free and friendly to free speech so that we can keep discussing those things, because that's where I learned about them. So
yes,
as long as we can keep doing that, we've got some hope. if they don't censor us on that as well, because we get censored a lot about COVID, on YouTube and elsewhere. So hopefully that won't bleed. Will get bigger. Basically,
we've already seen a lot of censorship of alternative, quote unquote, alternative, aka actually scientific dietary advice. I mean, I know Rob Wolf talked probably 2 years ago now at this point about how all of a sudden the traffic on his blog cratered by like 90%, and he had to rename it and recreate it to get around the censorship barriers.
I had the same problem with my company.
Really? Oh, you have?
Yeah. We were on a very good growth trajectory in terms of incoming traffic, and we ranked very well on the sort of topics that were relevant to our area, and Google just tanked us, basically just cut us down to less than a fifth of traffic from what we had before. And that's when they updated their, I can't even remember the stupid acronym they use, but it's basically about like your life, your health, something like that, and about how this information is, very important. So they're going to take all these measures to ensure that it comes from the respectable authorities, and that, your ranking as a function of how close you are to them, not about anything that's really semantically meaningful or, important, or so it's a mess. It's really Orwellian. And I think it's this big change that's happened that's maybe not clear to a lot of people yet, because it's sort of technical, the SEO aspect of Google and how
Yes.
things rank, but it's actually really, really important to how people get their information. So it's that's one of the scarier things that happened this year, in addition to the pandemic, is to see how easily information gets wiped out.
The pandemic was taking an existing attitude that only the medical professionals should have any ability to talk about these topics, and just applying it to this pandemic. Right. And I mean, shutting down, recognized experts who were all of a sudden no longer allowed to talk about it because they're not following the party line. Yeah, it's very alarming. It's not good. It's not good for any of us. So anyway, on that cheerful note.
Yeah, exactly. But it was super fun talking to you, and I liked the range of subjects we covered. So, next time you have a big blog post you want to go over, or something we want to debate, I think we should have a debate coming up with Gabor at some point. I think we should find something interesting to disagree upon and dig into it, the three of us. That would be fun.
Gabor is one of the guys I respect the most. He's rigorous. He and I have incredibly productive Twitter conversations that people really like, because they're like, why can't everybody have a conversation like this where it's just, he shows me evidence, I show him evidence, we have a discussion about it, and we say, okay, I mean, he and I pursue different avenues, but every time I talk to him, I learn something fascinating. He's,
Yeah, a lot of the best interactions are with people you can disagree with, actually, on Twitter, where it's a pleasure.
They're the only interesting ones. I hate talking to people who agree with me about everything. It's like, I'm not learning anything. I mean, it's nice to know that people agree with you, but
right.
Part of the fun of this whole thing is learning new stuff.
Yeah. So, okay. Anyway. Good. So we'll keep that in mind, and we'll try to set that up at some point.
That'd be great.
Yeah. So thanks for your time, and we'll take a look at your upcoming blog post. Remind us of the topic so people can keep an eye out for it.
What causes obesity? Of course.
What causes obesity? Nothing controversial. Yep. All right. Perfect. I'll let you get back to resting and eating, probably after a hard day of skiing.
Yes, that's the plan. Great. Thanks, Rafi.
Perfect. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.